The Tear Collector. Chapter 1. Glass Bottles. Lucas Vermeer lived alone in a quiet part of Delft. His house stood at the end of a narrow street, surrounded by old brick walls and ivy-covered fences. The windows were made of stained glass, and during the day, colored light danced across the wooden floors. But Lucas preferred the night. He worked when the city slept, when the streets were empty and the air was still. He was not a doctor, not a priest, not a healer in the usual sense. His work was different. Lucas was a tear collector. It was not a job anyone gave him. It was something he had always done, quietly, carefully, without asking for attention. He did not advertise. He did not explain. But people came. They came with heavy hearts, with silent grief, with pain they could not carry alone. Some arrived after losing someone they loved. Others came after years of sadness, after long silence, after moments they could not forget. They did not speak much. They sat in the chair near the window, and they cried. Lucas never asked why. He never interrupted. He simply placed a small glass bottle under each falling tear. He wore soft gloves, not to protect himself, but to show respect. He treated each tear like something sacred. He believed that every drop held a story, a memory, a truth. Each bottle was labeled with care. He wrote the person's name, the date, and a short note about the emotion. Sometimes it was loss, sometimes regret, sometimes hope. He placed the bottles on shelves that lined the walls of his study. The shelves were full, but never crowded. There was space between each bottle, as if each one needed room to breathe. Lucas did not collect tears for power or fame. He did not sell them. He did not use them for magic. He simply preserved them. He believed that emotions should not be forgotten. He believed that pain, once held gently, could become something meaningful. His house was quiet, but not cold. It smelled of old wood, dried herbs, and candle wax. The rooms were filled with soft light and soft sounds, the ticking of a clock, the rustle of paper, the distant hum of the city. Lucas moved slowly, always with purpose. He was a man of few words, but deep thoughts. He had lived this way for many years. He had seen many faces, many tears, many stories. But he never grew tired of the work. Each person was different. Each emotion was unique. He treated every visit as something important. Sometimes, people returned. They came back to see their bottle, to remember what they had felt, to understand what had changed. Lucas allowed it. He believed that healing was not about forgetting, but about seeing clearly. He kept a journal, not of names, but of feelings. He wrote about the weight of sorrow, the shape of longing, the color of joy. He believed that emotions had texture, sound, even temperature. He studied them like a scientist, but felt them like a poet. Lucas did not live in isolation. He walked through the city during the day, visited the market, nodded to neighbors. But he kept his work private. Only those who truly needed him found their way to his door. It was as if the house called to them, quietly, gently, when the time was right. He never judged anyone. He never told them what to feel. He simply listened with silence and collected with care. His bottles were not just containers. They were mirrors, memories, messages. They held the truth of being human. And so, in the heart of Delft, in a house full of light and quiet, Lucas Vermeer continued his work. He collected tears, not to erase pain, but to honor it. He believed that every emotion mattered. He believed that even sadness could shine. His shelves grew full, but his heart stayed open. He knew that the world was full of sorrow, but also full of meaning. And in each bottle, in each drop, he found a reason to keep going. Chapter 2. Ella. The rain had stopped, but the sky over Delft stayed gray. The streets were quiet, and the wind moved slowly between the buildings. Lucas Vermeer was sitting in his study, polishing the glass bottles on the shelf. Each one held a story. Each one held a moment someone could not carry alone. He worked with care, as always, but something in the air felt different that evening. There was a knock at the door. It was soft, almost uncertain. Lucas stood up, adjusted his gloves, and opened the door. A woman stood there, her coat damp from the rain, her eyes tired. She looked like someone who had walked a long way, not just through the city, but through something heavy inside. Her name was Ella Scheepers. She was 33 years old and worked as a librarian in the city. She lived alone in a small apartment near the canal. People knew her as kind and quiet, someone who always remembered which book a child liked or which poem helped an old man sleep. But lately, she had changed. Her smile had faded. Her voice had grown thin. She had lost her sister 3 months earlier, and the grief had settled deep inside her. Ella didn't speak much when Lucas let her in. She sat in the chair near the window, where the light from the stained glass made soft colors on the floor. She looked around the room, at the shelves, at the bottles, at the quiet piano in the corner. Then she began to cry. Lucas moved gently. He placed a clean bottle under her tears and waited. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer words. He simply listened with silence. The tears fell slowly, but they were heavy. Lucas felt it in the way the bottle warmed in his hand. These tears were not just sadness. They were full of memory, of love, of guilt, of longing. When Ella stopped crying, she looked at Lucas and nodded. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Lucas labeled the bottle with her name, the date, and one word: sister. But he didn't place it with the others. He stored it in a separate cabinet, one he rarely used. He felt that this bottle needed space. It carried something deeper than usual. Ella left quietly. Lucas watched her walk down the street, her steps slow but steady. He returned to his study and sat for a long time, looking at the bottle. He felt something shift inside him. He had collected many tears before, but these were different. They stayed with him longer. They echoed in the room. A week later, Ella returned. She looked different. Her face was still serious, but her eyes were clearer. She said the pain had faded. Not completely, but enough to breathe again. She had started reading poetry again. She had walked by the canal without crying. She had even smiled at a child in the library. Lucas listened. He didn't speak, but he understood. Something in the bottle had changed her. It had taken part of the weight and held it safely. It had given her space to feel without drowning. Lucas realized that his collection didn't just preserve emotions. It helped people heal. He began to think differently about his work. He still treated each bottle with care, but now he saw them as more than memories. They were bridges. They connected pain to peace. They allowed people to move forward without forgetting. Ella continued to visit. Sometimes she brought books for Lucas. Sometimes she just sat and watched the light. She didn't cry again, but she often looked at the cabinet where her bottle was stored. She said it helped to know it was there, that someone had held her sorrow without fear. Lucas found comfort in her presence. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't try to understand everything. She simply respected the silence. And in that silence, something gentle grew between them. The city outside remained busy, full of noise and movement. But inside Lucas's house, time slowed. The bottles glowed softly on the shelves. The piano stayed quiet. And the tear collector began to see that healing was not about removing pain, but about holding it with care. Ella's tears had opened a new door. Not just for her, but for Lucas too. He had always worked alone, but now he saw that connection was part of the process. That even in silence, people could share something real. And so, in the quiet heart of Delft, a librarian and a collector began to understand each other, not through words, but through the simple act of feeling. Chapter 3. The Price. Lucas Vermeer had always worked in silence. His house was quiet, his movements slow, his thoughts deep. He had learned to listen without words and to feel without touching. For years, he had collected tears with care, believing that he was simply preserving emotions. But something had begun to change. With each new bottle, Lucas felt more tired. It was not the kind of tiredness that came from lack of sleep. It was something deeper, something inside. His body moved slower. His hands felt heavier. His eyes, once sharp and observant, now lingered too long on empty spaces. He began to forget small things: where he had placed a bottle, what day it was, whether he had eaten. At first, he thought it was just the weight of time. But then the dreams started. Lucas had always dreamed in quiet colors, soft light, gentle sounds, peaceful places. But now his dreams were loud and full of shadows. He saw people he had never met. He heard screams that did not belong to him. He felt fear that came from memories he did not own. He woke up sweating, his heart racing, his mind confused. He began to recognize the faces in his dreams. They were the same people who had sat in his chair, who had cried into his bottles. He saw their pain, their loss, their secrets. He saw moments they had never spoken aloud. The bottles had not only held their tears, they had carried their stories. And now those stories were living inside him. Lucas tried to ignore it. He continued his work. He labeled each bottle, placed it on the shelf, and moved on. But the feeling grew stronger. He could no longer separate his own emotions from those he had collected. He felt sadness when he looked at the sky. He felt guilt when he touched a book. He felt grief when he heard music. These feelings were not his, but they lived in him. He stopped going to the market. He stopped walking by the canal. He stayed inside, surrounded by bottles, surrounded by memories. The house felt colder. The light from the stained glass windows no longer warmed the room. Even the piano, once a quiet companion, now seemed distant. Lucas began to write in his journal again. He wrote not about his own thoughts, but about the emotions that filled him. He described dreams in detail. He listed names he had never spoken. He tried to understand what was happening. He realized that he was not just a keeper of tears. He was a carrier. Each tear left a mark. Each bottle added weight. The more he collected, the less of himself remained. His own memories began to fade. He could not remember his childhood clearly. He could not recall the last time he had laughed. He felt like a shadow walking through his own life. Ella noticed the change. She came to visit and saw the difference in his eyes. She brought him tea, books, and quiet company. She did not ask questions, but she watched with care. Lucas appreciated her presence, but he could not explain what he felt. He feared that if he spoke, the emotions would spill out and never return. One evening, Lucas stood in front of the cabinet where he had placed Ella's bottle. He opened the door and looked at it. The glass was clear, but the liquid inside shimmered with something deep. He touched the bottle gently and felt a wave of warmth and sorrow. He understood that this bottle had changed him. Not because of its weight, but because of its truth. He began to wonder if healing others meant losing himself. He had helped people feel lighter, but he had taken their pain into his own heart. He had never asked for anything in return. He had never thought about the cost. Lucas sat by the window and watched the night fall over Delft. The city lights flickered. The wind moved through the trees. He felt both full and empty. He knew he could not continue like this forever. Something had to change. But he also knew that what he did mattered. The bottles were more than glass and liquid. They were proof that someone had felt, someone had survived, someone had shared. And even if he carried their pain, he had given them peace. In that moment, Lucas understood the price. It was not just tiredness or lost memories. It was the quiet fading of self, the slow blending of lives. He was no longer just Lucas Vermeer. He was a part of every person who had cried in his chair. And though it hurt, he accepted it. Because in every tear he held, there was a piece of truth. And truth, even when heavy, was worth carrying. Chapter 4. Healing. The quiet streets of Delft began to change. Word spread slowly, like a whisper passed from one heart to another. People spoke of a man who could hold sorrow without judgment, who could take tears and turn them into peace. They didn't know his name at first. They called him the man with the bottles, the one who listened without speaking. But Ella knew him as Lucas Vermeer. Ella had returned to her work at the library, but something inside her had shifted. She still missed her sister, but the pain no longer controlled her. She felt stronger, more open. She began to notice others who carried grief in silence. A woman who stared too long at a page. A man who returned the same book every week but never read it. A child who sat alone, drawing pictures of broken things. Ella didn't push them. She simply spoke gently and, when the time felt right, she told them about Lucas. One by one, they came. They knocked on his door, unsure, quiet, afraid to hope. Lucas welcomed them with silence. He offered no advice, no comfort, only space. They cried, and he collected. Each tear was placed in a bottle, labeled with care, stored with respect. And when they left, something inside them felt lighter, Lucas became known among those who suffered. Not famous, not celebrated, but trusted. People who had lost someone, people who had been hurt, people who carried invisible wounds, they came to him. They didn't expect miracles. They came because they needed someone who would not turn away. But as the bottles filled his shelves, Lucas began to change. He no longer remembered the names of the people who came. He forgot the order of the bottles. He walked through the city and didn't recognize familiar streets. He passed the bakery he had visited for years and didn't know it. He sat at his piano and couldn't remember the melody he used to play. Food lost its taste. Music lost its sound. Time lost its shape. Lucas wrote in his journal, but the words felt distant. He read old entries and didn't feel connected to them. He looked at his reflection and saw a man who was fading. The emotions he had collected were not just stored, they had entered him. They had filled the spaces where his own memories used to live. Ella noticed. She came more often, not just to bring books or tea, but to watch him. She saw the way he stared at the bottles too long. She saw the way he moved slowly, as if carrying something heavy. She saw the way he smiled, but only with his mouth, never with his eyes. She asked him to rest. She told him he had done enough. She said that healing others should not mean losing yourself. But Lucas shook his head. He believed he had a duty. He believed that if someone came to him in pain, he could not turn them away. He believed that his work mattered more than his own comfort. He continued to collect. He continued to listen. But inside, he was growing thin. One night, Lucas sat in his study, surrounded by bottles. The shelves were full. The room was quiet. He looked at the labels: loss, regret, fear, guilt, longing. He touched each bottle gently, as if greeting old friends. He felt their weight. He felt their stories. He felt their truth. He knew he was changing. He knew he was becoming something else, not just a man, but a vessel. He had taken in so much pain that his own voice was hard to hear. But he also knew that every bottle had helped someone. Every tear had been honored. Every emotion had been seen. And that, to him, was worth the price. Ella sat with him the next day. She didn't speak. She simply placed her hand near his and let the silence fill the room. Lucas didn't cry. He didn't smile. But he felt her presence, and it reminded him of something important. Healing was not just about removing pain. It was about sharing it. It was about being seen. It was about knowing that someone else cared enough to carry a part of it with you. Lucas had carried many parts. He had held many stories. And though he was tired, he still believed in the work. In the heart of Delft, behind stained glass windows and shelves of quiet bottles, healing continued, not with loud words or bright light, but with gentle tears and silent understanding. Chapter 5. Overflow. It was a quiet afternoon in Delft. The sky was pale, and the wind moved gently through the narrow streets. Lucas Vermeer sat in his study, surrounded by shelves of glass bottles. The room was filled with soft light from the stained glass windows. Each bottle held a story, a moment of sorrow, a piece of someone's heart. Lucas had grown used to the weight of these emotions. He carried them like shadows, always present but never loud. That day, a boy came to his door. He was no older than 10. His coat was too big, and his shoes were wet from the canal path. He didn't speak. He simply looked up at Lucas with wide, tired eyes. Lucas understood. He led the boy inside and offered him the chair near the window. The boy sat down slowly, his hands shaking. Then the tears came. Lucas moved gently, as he always did. He placed a clean bottle under the boy's face and waited. The tears fell quickly, one after another, like rain that had been held back too long. Lucas felt the warmth of each drop. He felt the depth of the boy's pain. It was not just sadness. It was something heavier. It was the kind of grief that had no words. As the bottle filled, Lucas noticed something strange. The glass began to shimmer, not with light, but with energy. The liquid inside swirled in a way he had never seen before. It pulsed, as if alive. Lucas tried to steady his hands, but the bottle grew warm, then hot. A small crack appeared near the base. He reached for another bottle, but it was too late. The glass split with a soft sound. The emotions inside escaped. They did not spill like water. They spread like air, invisible but strong. Lucas felt them enter his body all at once. He felt the boy's fear, his confusion, his loneliness. He felt the moment the boy had found his mother's empty chair. He felt the silence of the house, the weight of unanswered questions, the cold of a world that had changed too fast. Lucas collapsed. He fell to the floor, his gloves slipping from his hands. The room spun around him. The bottles on the shelves seemed to blur. The light from the windows faded. He felt himself sinking, not into sleep, but into something deeper. A place where all the emotions he had ever collected lived together. A place where his own voice was lost among many. He woke up a day later. The room was quiet. The boy was gone. Ella was sitting beside him, her hand resting near his. She had found him unconscious and stayed. She had cleaned the broken glass and placed a blanket over him. She didn't speak. She simply waited. Lucas opened his eyes slowly. His body felt weak, but his mind was clear. For the first time in months, he felt his own thoughts. He remembered his name, his house, the sound of his piano. He remembered the way the wind moved through the trees outside. He remembered Ella's voice, soft and steady. He sat up with effort and looked around. The shelves were still full, but something had changed. He understood now that he had reached his limit. His body could no longer hold the pain of others. His heart had stretched too far. The bottles had become too heavy. The emotions had begun to live inside him, not just pass through. Lucas knew he had to stop. Not forever, but for now. He needed time to rest, to recover, to remember who he was. He needed to find a way to continue without losing himself. He had helped many people, but he had forgotten to care for his own soul. Ella brought him tea and sat with him in silence. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. She saw it in his eyes. She saw the change. She saw the man who had given so much and now needed to be held. Lucas looked at the broken bottle on the table. He picked up the largest piece and held it in his hand. It was smooth, clear, and sharp. He placed it in a small box and closed the lid. He would keep it as a reminder, not of failure, but of truth. He had learned that emotions were powerful. They could heal, but they could also harm. They needed space, care, and balance. He had learned that even the strongest heart had limits. And he had learned that healing others must begin with healing yourself. Outside, the city moved on. People walked, talked, and lived. But inside the house with stained glass windows, a tear collector sat quietly, holding a piece of glass and a piece of himself. He was tired, but he was still here. And that, for now, was enough. Chapter 6. The Letter. The days in Delft grew colder. Autumn leaves covered the streets, and the wind carried the smell of rain and old stone. Lucas Vermeer spent most of his time indoors, surrounded by shelves of glass bottles. His house was quiet, filled with soft light and the gentle ticking of a clock. After the collapse, he had stopped collecting new tears. He needed time to rest, to think, to feel his own thoughts again. One afternoon, Ella Scheepers arrived with a small envelope in her hand. She had been visiting regularly, bringing books, tea, and quiet company. She didn't speak much, but her presence helped Lucas stay grounded. That day, she placed the envelope on the table and said it was from someone Lucas had helped a year ago. Lucas opened the letter slowly. The handwriting was neat and careful. The woman wrote that she had come to him during a time of deep sorrow. Her husband had died suddenly, and she had felt lost. She remembered sitting in his chair, crying without words, and watching him collect her tears with quiet respect. She had left feeling lighter, as if part of her pain had been held safely. Now, a year later, she felt joy again. She had started painting, walking by the canal, laughing with friends. But something inside her felt strange. She feared she was forgetting. Not just the pain, but the love, the depth of what she had lived through. She wanted to return part of her sorrow. She wanted to remember fully, even if it hurt. Lucas read the letter twice. He sat in silence, thinking about what it meant. He had always believed that his bottles helped people heal. But he had never considered what healing might take away. Pain was not just suffering. It was memory. It was connection. It was proof that something had mattered. He walked to the cabinet where her bottle was stored. He found it easily. The label was still clear. Her name, the date, one word, loss. He held the bottle in his hands and felt the weight of it. It was not heavy, but it was full of meaning. He placed it in a small box and gave it to Ella to deliver. That moment changed something in Lucas. He began to think about the bottles differently. They were not just containers of sorrow. They were pieces of life. Some people might need to let go. Others might need to hold on. Healing was not the same for everyone. He started writing letters to those whose bottles he still kept. He asked if they wanted their tears back. Not to carry the pain again, but to remember, to reflect, to understand. Some people refused. They said they had moved on and didn't want to reopen old wounds. Others accepted. They came quietly, took their bottles, and sat with them for a while. Some cried again. Some smiled. Some simply held the glass and said thank you. Lucas didn't judge. He didn't explain. He simply offered. This became a new phase in his work. He was no longer just a collector. He was a guide. He helped people see that emotions were not problems to fix. They were parts of life to live with. He saw that healing was not about erasing pain. It was about making space for it, learning from it, and letting it grow into something meaningful. Ella helped him organize the bottles. She created a small book where people could write their thoughts after receiving their tears. Some wrote poems. Some wrote memories. Some wrote nothing at all. But the book became a quiet record of what it meant to feel. Lucas felt stronger. He still carried many emotions, but now he understood them better. He saw that his work was not about holding everything forever. It was about sharing, returning, and trusting people to carry their own stories. The house in Delft remained quiet, but it was no longer heavy. The shelves still held bottles, but they also held hope. And in the center of it all, Lucas Vermeer continued his work, not as a man who collected sorrow, but as someone who helped others find meaning in their pain. He had learned that memory and emotion were deeply connected. To forget pain was sometimes to forget love. And to remember, even when it hurt, was to honor what had been real. Chapter 7. Silence. The winter in Delft arrived quietly. The canals froze at the edges, and the rooftops turned white with frost. The city moved slower, wrapped in scarves and silence. Lucas Vermeer no longer collected tears. His shelves, once filled with bottles of sorrow, now stood mostly empty. A few remained, carefully stored, but the room had changed. It was no longer a place of quiet pain. It had become something else. Lucas had opened a small workshop near the edge of the city. It was a simple space with wooden tables, soft lamps, and shelves filled with tools and glass. The windows were large, letting in the pale winter light. The air smelled of melted wax, warm tea, and old paper. He no longer worked alone. Ella Scheepers had become his helper, his partner, his quiet strength. Together, they taught people how to make bottles, not for tears, but for stories. People came from different places. Some were young, some old. Some had lost someone, others had simply lived through hard days. They came not to cry, but to create. Lucas showed them how to shape the glass, how to hold it gently, how to give it meaning. Ella helped them write small notes to place inside, memories, thoughts, wishes, or words they had never spoken aloud. The workshop became a place of stillness and warmth. People sat at the tables, working with their hands, sharing in soft voices, or simply listening. There was no rush. No pressure. Just time and space to feel. Lucas found peace in this new rhythm. He no longer carried the weight of others' pain inside his body. He no longer woke from dreams that were not his. He still remembered the bottles, the tears, the stories, but now he saw them as part of a larger picture. Pain was not something to erase. It was something to understand. He watched people shape their own bottles and saw how their hands changed. At first, they were unsure, nervous, afraid to break the glass. But slowly, they grew steady. They learned to trust the process. They learned that even something fragile could hold strength. Ella brought her own light to the space. She greeted each person with kindness. She remembered their names, their favorite tea, the way they liked to sit. She helped them find the right words for their notes. She never pushed, never asked too much. She simply listened. Her presence made the workshop feel like home. Lucas and Ella worked side by side, often in silence. They didn't need many words. They understood each other through small gestures, a glance, a nod, a shared smile. They had both carried sorrow. They had both learned to live with it. And now, they helped others do the same. One evening, after the last visitor had left, Lucas stood by the window and looked out at the quiet street. Snow was falling gently. The world looked soft and clean. He thought about the years he had spent collecting tears. He thought about the people who had come to him, broken and afraid. He thought about the bottles, the dreams, the collapse, the letter. He didn't regret any of it. But he knew now that healing was not about taking pain away. It was about making space for it. It was about learning to live with it, to carry it without letting it crush you. It was about sharing it, so it didn't grow too heavy. Lucas turned back to the room. Ella was sweeping the floor, humming a quiet tune. The shelves were filled with new bottles, each one different, each one made by someone who had chosen to remember, to feel, to heal. He felt something inside him settle. Not joy, not sadness, something deeper. A kind of peace that came from knowing he had done what he could. That he had helped. That he had changed, and let others change too. In the heart of Delft, in a small workshop filled with light and silence, Lucas Vermeer found himself again. Not as a collector of tears, but as a witness to life. And in that silence, he discovered something true. Moral. True healing doesn't mean removing pain. It means accepting it. Emotions are not weakness, they are memory. Only by living through them can we become whole. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.